Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for your presence here tonight at Cape Breton University. I'm Father Doug McDonald, the chaplain here, and I also work with the Newman Society. And without any delay, I'd like to invite up one of the students who's part of the Newman Society, also a CBU student. She lives at the Newman House, and her name is Priyanka. Priyanka, could you come forward to read the biography of our special guest lecturer?
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Priyanka Sebastian, a student here at CBU. I'm from South Africa, and as Father Doug said, I live at the Newman Society House, and I'm part of the chaplaincy ministry team here at CBU. I will give a brief biography of our guest of honor. Mary Hynes is the longtime host of Tapestry, CBC Radio's weekly exploration of spirituality, philosophy, and the search for meaning. Before finding religion, the beat, Mary covered an eclectic range of stories in news and sports in a career spanning newspapers, wire services, radio, and television. Hynes has reported from 23 countries and covered 3 Olympic Games. She is the former host of CBC Radio's The Inside Track, Sports, and TVO's Imprint books, and is a former co-host of the live nightly news show Studio 2 at TVO. Hynes also spent several years as a sports reporter at the Globe and Mail. Mary Hynes lives in Toronto with her family and her electric basses. She will one day nail I Want You Back by the Jackson 5, but not anytime soon. I would now like to welcome Dr. Michael Higgins to give a formal welcome to our guest. He is the Basilian Distinguished Fellow in Contemporary Catholic Thought at St. Michael's College.
Thank you, Priyanka. There's a special kind of charm and symmetry in being asked to welcome Mary here, because I had the privilege of being the first Greg MacLeod lecturer a few years ago and stood at this podium. Also, our paths have crossed in the Toronto media world on more than one occasion, so it's marvelous to be able to say a few words about Mary before you hear her. Media folk as much mold as they are molded by the society in which they live. Genuine media professionals attend to the times and to the issues and to the personalities. Exceptional media professionals go a step further and serve as vehicles of enhanced understanding and self-discovery. One such professional is tonight's Greg MacLeod speaker, Mary Hynes. But how would you define Greg MacLeod? Okay, so I'll start now. In 2 days' time, I'll come back and we'll have a quick précis. But I have a bit of an idea. Welcoming person, generosity of heart, intellectual curiosity, and extraterritorial sensibility or perspective. And I think if you look closely, that's Mary Hynes as well. Now, they are, of course, in many ways unlike, but with these 4 defining qualities, you can see why the choice of Mary as this year's Greg MacLeod speaker is a wise one. Faith, social activism, all the pursuits that deepen and indeed enrich our humanity as spiritual beings. Well, this is the stuff, in their individual way, that makes Greg and Mary worth reading, worth listening to, and worth remembering. Mary Hynes.
and this should do it. Does this work for volume?
Yes.
Oops. Are we a bit feedbacky, or will we be?
Okay. It's off.
It's up.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, thanks so much.
Still there. Okay.
And I'll try, is this still?
Yes.
Oh, okay. There's the sweet spot. Thank you. Good, thank you. Michael Higgins, that was extraordinary. Thank you for that lovely, generous introduction. Father Greg MacLeod, what an extraordinary human being. I need to start with a confession, if I may. When Father Bill and Father Doug extended this lovely invitation to me, I wanted to learn more about Greg MacLeod and his work. And as I was doing a little research, I became quite convinced that there were two Greg MacLeods. And I kept looking for my Greg MacLeod, because this superstar businessman who was beaming in a photo with the Prime Minister of South Korea, that couldn't be my Father Greg. My Father Greg was a scholar and a philosopher and a priest. And of course, the joke was on me. This was my Father Greg being made an honorary citizen of South Korea. And think about that for a second. To be called to the priesthood as a young man would have been a life of service aplenty, a life of service to your community, of service to your faith. To become a philosopher and a scholar and to help create this university here in Cape Breton, that could have been the work of a lifetime. To work in international development, in community development, to have your name spoken with reverence all over the world, to have your books translated into Japanese and Spanish and Korean, to do so much for the economic well-being of your beloved Cape Breton, and all the while to tend to the spiritual element of every soul you meet in your travels, while having a really good time with dancing and music, I am told. I wish I could have met him. I think Father Greg embodied one of our favorite themes on Tapestry, which is the CBC radio show where I work. Some of the best interviews are with people who find the spiritual dimension in all of human experience, whether their own field is astrophysics or economic development or baseball. And much like my research into Greg MacLeod, thinking, well, that can't be the same guy, I love meeting guests where the spiritual element at first glance might come as a bit of a surprise. And I'm thinking here of a fellow named John Polkinghorne, one of my all-time favorite interviews. I really like it when I'm out of my league intellectually, and it happens all the time. John Polkinghorne was a particle physicist and an Anglican priest. And what you sometimes find with certified geniuses is that they are incredibly generous in conversation. My chat with John Polkinghorne was quite a long one. This was in 2009, and you were hearing a lot from the new atheists at the time. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens. We had a few of them on Tapestry. And I remember something John Polkinghorne said about the atheist worldview. He described it as being grotesquely impoverished. Direct quote, grotesquely impoverished. Polkinghorne said his own life had taught him something very different. That he had always detected in the world what he called signals of transcendence. Signals of transcendence. What a beautiful way to find language for something that really resists being put into words. There was another phrase of his, And it struck me as, it sounded like a remark from someone who spent a lot of time in labs. It sounded as though it could have been a clinical result of one of his experiences in the lab. He said he found that in life, joy just keeps breaking in. And this was extraordinary to him. And what I find so striking about a guest like this, with John Polkinghorne, it was very clear that this was not an expert in quantum mechanics who then parked his intelligence and parked his intellect at the door when he donned his vestments as an Anglican priest. It almost sounded again like he were explaining a theorem when he told me a little bit about his faith life, and he said, belief in God ties things together, and that theism explains more. When John Polkinghorne died in 2021, an obituary in the Times of London leaned heavily into that apparent contradiction. You know, how could an Anglican priest be one of the world's greatest minds in particle physics? And there was a great line in the paper. Polkinghorne was evidence that physicists, just like believers, are quite prepared to trust in unseen realities, providing the motivations, the relevant motivations, are persuasive enough. An idea you would hear a lot from the new atheists, and the old atheists, come to that, was that belief in God is something that you outgrow. You know, that it's some kind of wish fulfillment, and that it's something that no serious-minded person could take to heart. That it's a worldview that you outgrow. And there was this genius, John Polkinghorne, sensing these signals of transcendence and affirming that joy keeps breaking in, and insisting that to be a believer simply explains more about who we are and why we're here. And in the presence of a mind and a heart like that, this idea, thank you. Shall I carry on? Would you? Okay. This idea that you have to be somehow deluded to be a believer just evaporates. It becomes ludicrous. Another interview I loved, and again, this was someone who might not have been considered a natural fit on a show where we try to investigate what it means to be human. This is Marjorie Harris, who's so well known as a gardener and a garden writer. But when I think of Marjorie, I can still hear her say in an episode we called Back to the Garden, when you see a flower in bloom, if you look directly into its face, I think you're sort of looking into the face of God. And Marjorie went on to say, I mean, if God is everywhere, and some people think that, then God can't not be in the face of a plant. And then she was talking about her own backyard in the heart of Toronto. And Marjorie Harris said, on those days when I'm ready for it, it's like walking into a cathedral. It's a place where you think, how could anybody have created this? This is just perfect. It's funny now, I've been sifting through some of these Tapestry episodes, getting ready to come and talk to you. And I'm generally pretty good with follow-up questions. I don't let tantalizing thoughts go by without really buttonholing the guest and saying, can I take you back to can you just explain this to me a little bit more? And I wish I had asked Marjorie Harris about that one line, on those days when I'm ready for it. And looking at that fragment of an answer now, I'm kicking myself because I'm so curious, what does it mean to be ready for it? For that kind of transcendent experience, literally in your own backyard, what does it take to be ready for it? What does a day like that feel like? Are you preparing for it somehow? Is that readiness somehow important? A short while later, after that episode went to air, I ran into Marjorie's husband, who's the writer Jack Batten, and it was so lovely. He said he'd never heard Marjorie sound like that in an interview. And that was not my skill, that was her skill. And that's the privilege of working on Tapestry, because we get to ask people the kind of questions that they're not really asked on many other shows, in many other places in the media. When Marjorie was doing a call-in show on CBC Radio, which she did quite often, or any place really, she would typically be asked something like, okay, my garden has clay soil and really heavy shade, what should I be planting? And just to be clear, I consider that a very important question. I would love to know the answer to that. But there just aren't many places where you can go to ask the kind of questions that we get to ask on Tapestry, just to sort of ponder some of the more eternal questions. An old sports colleague of mine, Kevin Sylvester, has guest hosted Tapestry, and Kevin used to say, Tapestry is the kind of place where you get to think about all that stuff you're just too busy to think about during the week. And with Marjorie Harris and with a lot of other people in that episode, that entire episode was about gardening as a spiritual act. And that was a bit of a leap of faith for us at first. The idea sounded a little bit out there, even for us. But we ended up with so much material we couldn't fit it into a single episode. And that ended up being a 2-hour special called Back to the Garden. And I remember being a little sheepish when we were putting that episode together, because some of the content was what we call streeters. And you've seen this, you'll go out with a microphone and a recording machine, and you'll just stop random strangers and ask them to speak to you. And we did our streeters at an event called Canada Blooms, which was a huge trade show and convention held in March in cities across the country, getting people ready for the gardening season. And I wasn't at all sure that people who had bought their tickets for Canada Blooms left their homes that morning thinking, wow, I really hope somebody asks me about a divine creator. I really hope someone asks me whether being in my garden gives me that ineffable sense of being connected to something larger than myself. So I was a little nervous, but the response was overwhelming. The way someone's eyes would light up when we posed those questions, and how they'd find the words to express things that can defy being put into language. I remember one woman who was at Canada Blooms, a woman we accosted, just total stranger. And when I approached her, microphone and recorder in hand, she must have thought I was going to ask her about the quality of her soil, or what are your favorite perennials? Again, I do consider these to be very important questions, but she understood the Tapestry angle immediately. And she spoke so beautifully and in this tone of wonder about having transcendent experiences in her garden, and her garden feeling like a kind of cathedral to her. And then we turned the mic over to her husband, and it was harder for him. Both harder to have that initial experience and harder to talk about it. And what he finally said was, it's more opaque for me. The experience was not as readily available to him as it was to his wife. And I've never forgotten that. He had this sense that he was feeling something very much like John Polkinghorne's Signals of Transcendence, but in a way that was a little bit harder to discern, a little bit more opaque, to use his phrase. And to me, that was just as moving as the eloquent stories his wife was telling. Whatever life force, whatever essence of the divine she was finding in her garden, it wasn't coming as easily to him, but that did not lead him towards skepticism or cynicism or shutting the idea down. He was feeling something quite profound in the garden, just in a very quiet way. On another episode, I remember interviewing an architect named Anthony Lawler. And Anthony talked to us about designing space for the soul. And he was not using the word soul the way so many trendy magazines use it, to mean, with this designer's stamp of approval, or it's the latest shade of green that everybody should be using, or the way they use soulful is a bit sketchy. Anthony Lawler meant using architecture and the built environment as a way to connect with something profound, really deep inside the human being. Shelter, and he had this wonderful idea that the home is the source, not the source, the home is the conduit for all these gifts, all these elements. You turn on your tap, and there is the gift of water. You put the kettle on or turn the heat on, and there is the elemental gift of fire. And it was a way of seeing what's all around you with new eyes. There was a quality of attentiveness there and awareness and a quality of gratitude. And I loved that Tapestry got away with talking to an architect. It may not have been the first person you'd expect to be on a program like this. And again, it's this idea that the spiritual element of anything doesn't have to be separate, doesn't have to be put in its own box and delivered strictly on a Sunday morning in a chapel from a pulpit. That those conversations can be woven into everyday life. I've always really liked the Aldous Huxley quote, after silence, that which comes nearest to expressing the inexpressible is music. And that we have found to be true. Some of the most satisfying interviews we've ever broadcast have been with musicians. And it makes me happy to think that Father Greg might have approved of that. He was clearly someone who loved music. I'm told someone who loved to dance. We've had spiritual wisdom on our show from Mavis Staples and Hawksley Workman and Al Green, the Reverend Al Green now. And I think of Victor Wooten, a musical genius and bass player. And here was a guy whose ideas about spirituality and music could not have been more profound if he had been speaking from a cathedral on a Sunday morning, or from a mosque, or from a shul. Victor runs a summer camp for bass players, and it's a blend of music and nature and spirituality, except that Victor Wooten would not make a distinction among any of those things. He would not be putting them in separate categories. He told me one of the most spiritual things he's ever done in his life is at camp, that sensation of rubbing two sticks together and getting fire and thinking there is something sublime at work here. Victor was on Tapestry after writing a book called The Music Lesson, a spiritual search for growth through music. And this might have been my all-time favorite behind the scenes moment at Tapestry. I didn't want to say anything on the air about being a bass player myself, because I'm not very good, even though I've been at it for a really long time. But it also felt kind of cheesy. It felt like Victor in the bass world is just, he is just on all kinds of pedestals. And I thought, something like having Picasso on and saying, oh, you paint too. I paint. Let's talk about how we're painters. So I did not go there at all. But when the interview was over, and he was such a lovely guy, I said, could you say hi to my bass teacher? Can I get this on tape? Victor Wooten saying hi to Joanne. And he did. He gave my bass teacher, Joe, the most beautiful hello. And he picked on something I had said to him about her, that she tells me all the time, if there's a time when you're discouraged or strung out or fed up, you can just hold the bass. An electric bass is, it's like holding a beast. It's a very, very heavy thing, but there is something really physical and comforting about having it plugged in and you are just holding it. And I don't know what the theology of this is, whether it's true that we all land with a sin we are particularly prone to, or a fault we are going to fall into despite our best efforts. Mine is certainly discouragement, if that's a thing, and some of the more theologically expert people can guide me on this a bit later, I think. I get discouraged a lot, and this idea that it's okay if you don't know how to play, I want you back on the bass. You can just hold the bass on the days when you are just losing your mind with discouragement. And Victor Wooten thanked her for that, and he said, that tells me what an excellent bass teacher you are, that you could say, just hold the bass. And it makes a lot of sense that they would connect over that idea, because one of the exercises Victor Wooten runs at his base camp is to have all the campers blindfolded. All of the basses are in a large room, and the campers then try to make their way to their own base with a blindfold on. They roam around and try somehow to listen to the gut, listen to an intuition, listen to I don't even know, and try to find their base. And Victor Wooten said it is a stunning scene. It is stunning to see this unfold, to see how often people will make their way blindfold on to their own base. And this is challenging for all of us who work on the show. It's beautiful, but some of us came up through the news system. We have a lot of serious experience in journalism, covering breaking stories. We have some serious experience behind us. And there are moments on Tapestry when the usual questions in journalism, okay, let's pin this down. Who, what, where, when, why, how, they really don't get you very far. I can't explain how Victor Wooten's campers are more often than not following something intuitive and landing in the arms of their own base, and often then bursting into tears because, oh yes, of course, it's you. Of course I've found my way back to you. So this is an interesting nook to occupy in journalism, where you're curious about something, you think you're asking sound, solid, good questions, but a lot of the answers verge on something just unknowable, or ineffable, or mysterious, and in no way conforming to the journalistic conventions that many of us really hold dear, the who, what, where, when, why, how. One of my favorite examples was an interview with the writer Patricia Pearson. Patricia had studied people who are absolutely certain they have seen or spoken to friends or relatives who have died. She wrote about encounters on the battlefield. This is an iconic story that you sometimes hear. A stranger will appear to a soldier who's in trouble and will lead that person to safety. And then the soldier turns around to say thank you, and there's nobody there. Patricia wrote a book called Opening Heaven's Door, What the Dying May Be Trying to Tell Us About Where They Are Going. And then what you need to know about Patricia Pearson is that she is about as tough-minded as it gets as an investigator. I love her phrase, I am a rational Enlightenment Scot. You know, nobody was going to be pulling wool over her eyes, and she is not a credulous person. And a CBC colleague of mine listened to that interview, listened to Patricia Pearson talking about things which to a purely rational mind are impossible. And this very senior level CBC person said, Patricia Pearson should be on the National. Why are we not having a conversation about it? This should be on the news. And when you listen to Patricia Pearson, you're getting into something quite profound and mysterious, and I think almost entirely unexplored in the serious media. What happens when we die? You know, one of what we call on the show the big ticket items, and those are conversations you can readily or easily have as a journalist. I don't usually meet guests outside the studio, but after that conversation, I had devoured this book, and we devoted the whole episode to Patricia's work, which we sometimes do, but not that often. And when that conversation was over, we stayed in touch and decided we just really needed to drink some gin together to process some of this. And we had dinner, we had gin. Patricia told me her book was doing incredibly well in many places around the world and absolutely tanked in Great Britain, was not welcome at all in Great Britain. And she knew why. She had been told by publishers, by reviewers, that stories about any kind of life after death were seen as being tainted in Great Britain because they pointed to some kind of belief or spirituality. And too many people there apparently considered the subject matter untouchable. It's not for a sophisticated, educated audience of readers, listeners, viewers. There was a piece in the Guardian newspaper a while back with the headline, "The Media's Trouble with Religion." And columnist, a fellow named Alan Wilson, wrote, "It has to be admitted that religion is a dimension of human existence that is almost impossible to represent readily within the conventions of the journalistic mechano set that characterizes much English media output. English journalism just doesn't do God, doesn't know how to, doesn't want to know how to. It's obvious that sneering is a suitable substitute for analysis. That's all there is to it." End of Alan Wilson's quote. And I think that writer was really onto something, and I believe he's right. Sneering is not a good substitute for a thoughtful conversation about some of these big ticket items. In fairness to journalists, though, I guess a lot of what we're trying to talk about can be really hard to put into words. It can be a real challenge to find language for some of this. We keep trying, week after week. We sometimes joke the show should just be 52 minutes of silence. And just, the news would come on, and then you'd have just this blank hour where Tapestry would be. And that would be fitting, because really, how are you going to find words for some of these things? We also explored spirituality in another area that might have seemed like an unlikely venue for this sort of search. And that was sports. That was another show we could not fit into 1 hour. It became a 2-part special called The Power and the Glory. And in those episodes, you would have heard Clara Hughes, the winter and summer Olympic star, talking about how much she had learned from Joseph Campbell and why mythology had become so important to her, and why the idea of the hero's journey became such a profound teaching for her. And what I found so extraordinary about that conversation, I spent 9 years covering sports, and Clara Hughes operated at the highest level of her sports, speed skating and cycling. And when you're at that level, everything is about the result, or so we're led to believe. After Ben Johnson failed his drug test at the 1988 Seoul Olympics, I had covered that story in Seoul, and I was assigned to cover the Dublin inquiry afterwards. This was a judicial inquiry into doping in sport in Canada, and it was a phenomenal experience, one of my favorite assignments ever. Every day we were hearing expert testimony on ethics and philosophy and sports science and chemistry and biology, and one speaker was brought to tears remembering that the figure skater Brian Orser had won a silver medal at the Calgary Olympics, and so many sports columnists the next day called him a loser, and that he choked because he did not bring home the gold. And here was Clara Hughes, an elite athlete, among the best in the world, someone who had also known the agony of defeat, by the way, talking about the journey being everything. And that's what she had learned with the help of Joseph Campbell and the study of mythology. And Clara is no Pollyanna about this. Every time she stood on a medal podium, it was a hard-fought, hard-won experience. But she was sharing something she had learned along the way about John Polkinghorne's signals of transcendence. There is something more to this experience. There's something more to this path I'm on and to this life I'm living. In that same episode, you would have heard the scholar and runner, Bruce Kidd, in an interview, both of us crying on the radio, both of us becoming very teary-eyed on the air. And we were talking about the kind of connection you can feel in a sports stadium when your voice is lifted alongside 50,000 other people or 5,000 other people. It doesn't even have to be on that huge a stage. You're sharing something that doesn't feel like it's just a game. and you are part of a collective, and whether you are singing or cheering or chanting, you are with your people. You are all experiencing this moment and feeling a kind of connection, a kind of shared humanity that can be kind of elusive in the year 2023. So Bruce Kidd and I, crying on the radio and getting these goosebumps, thinking about all the time in sports when we felt those transcendent moments of connection, those moments of community, those signals of transcendence. And just on that note of goosebumps, I need to go back for a second and give credit to Victor Wooten's mom, Victor Wooten, the bass player. He quoted her during our interview, and apparently one of the many things she taught Victor was always pay attention when you get goosebumps, because goosebumps never lie. We do seem to return to sports as a theme, fairly often. I was in the sports world a lot, covered 3 Olympics. I once had a boss say to me in television, "You can take the girl out of sports." And it was not a compliment, I think. Someone asked me once what kind of act of God it takes to move from sports to spirituality when you're a journalist. And I don't think they're that far apart. And I've come to think of this as the Father Greg effect, if I may. You can have a spiritual experience in what some people might consider a very unlikely place. In economic development, for instance, or in sports, or in gardening, or in particle physics, the spiritual element can be there. It's like that lovely saying by Théâtre de Chardin, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. I promise this is the last thing I'm going to say about sports, but I think it says something important about Tapestry. After the Barcelona Olympics, my favorite games ever to cover, Silken Laumann had become quite famous in Canada. To a degree she found a little unnerving, and this wasn't just because she won the bronze medal in the single sculls, but a couple of months before the game in training, I think this was on Elk Lake near Victoria, a German pair crashed into Silken and her boat was shattered and her leg was just horribly, horribly damaged. Just so close to the Olympics. So her recovery and her perseverance and just her faith in herself and her courage made for a wonderful story. But after the games, Silken Laumann could barely go grocery shopping without attracting a crowd. And she found this uncomfortable. So one night she went to a party and she ended up having a conversation with someone she didn't know. And she had an experience that was quite unusual. And she told me later, in this tone of voice that was just filled with wonder, it was as though my real person was talking to his real person. And we've written that phrase down because it's become kind of a touchstone for the way we like to approach interviews on Tapestry every week. My real person is going to be speaking to someone else's real person, to the guest's real person, and by extension, we're both speaking to your real person when you're listening. In March 2020, as the pandemic hit, we tried to figure out what Tapestry should sound like and whether we might be useful to people somehow. And that first episode, that March 29th episode, began with a kind of vow. We were opening the show with a pre-recorded interview, something we had put in the can, as the saying goes, before things really started to fall apart. This was an interview from England with a priest. It was about a pilgrimage, and it touched on the idea of joy. And at first we thought, well, this is a disaster. Like, hi, welcome to COVID. Today on Tapestry, wall-to-wall joy. It's like, do you people even live in the real world? So the show began with my real person attempting to talk to your real person, and it opened up. What a strange time to be talking about joy. But here's what we're thinking at Tapestry, and this is how we're going to approach the next little while. No matter where you are, or how you're feeling, or what's on your mind right now, if you feel like a little bit of company, we are here. Some interviews will touch on the pandemic. Others will be more of a little oasis an invitation to think about something else from time to time. And then came the apology when I explained that half of that episode had been recorded at the broadcast center on this state-of-the-art equipment, and the other half was me recording on my second-hand iPhone, which I bought from someone's mom. I don't know, I might not even, it might have had 5 owners before me. It's a real 6S. It's really, it's old and sad. And me recording in my living room. And we just asked people to bear with us as we were trying to figure this thing out and do radio from our kitchens and try to see what's a safe way to have guests in places where we can talk to them. The interviews in the early days of COVID, that March, April, probably even into May in 2020, were just almost unbearably poignant to me. There was one day we wanted to just really get ahead of the game, so we recorded all day long, just one interview after another, which we don't usually do on a show like ours, and I cried all day long. Cried during interviews, cried between interviews, and it wasn't all particularly heartbreaking stuff. One guy ran a grocery store in Manitoba, and we were talking about toilet paper, and we were talking about flour and trying to keep stuff on the shelf. But there was something about this moment, connecting with each guest and connecting with the listener, and it felt like the most raw version of my real person talking to your real person. After a while, we thought it would be a good idea to leaven things with music quite regularly in a way that we planned every week. So we launched a music feature called Soundtrack for the Soul. And we'd ask people, listeners and guests, what's the song that's getting you through this? Is there a singer? Is there a band? Is something lifting your spirits? Giving you some guidance, really reaching you at this moment? What's giving you life right now? And we learned a lot about music as a kind of lifeline during a really challenging time, a really scary time. And then as the pandemic went on, we're still in it, of course, but some new habits began to take hold. People began to navigate things, began to navigate life, and the mail took a real turn. A lot of people had this overflowing anger, this diffuse, scattershot, all-encompassing anger at the world and at us. Tapestry did maybe the most benign interview I have ever been part of in my life. Lovely young man, didn't have much outdoor space, but he began cultivating bonsai trees on his fire escape. And tending to that little patch of life, he said, felt like he was putting himself in touch with all life, capital L, life. There was something life-giving for him to be nurturing these tiny trees and cutting them into beautiful shapes and sculpting them during this really frightening time in the world. He was keeping something alive. And if I had any concerns about that interview, it might have been that it was just too wholesome. It was awfully, awfully sweet. The mail from listeners was so nasty. It was so nasty. We were floored. One guy wrote in, I had mentioned in the episode that I thought the art of bonsai, I didn't know anything about bonsai. I thought it required some kind of special tree to start with. So I didn't think you could just grab any tree from the garden center of Home Depot and start sculpting it into little shapes. And the guest said, no, that's exactly what you do. You can do it with a tree you find anywhere. Well, guy writes in to say, could Mary Hynes please try not to kill off the independent nurseries and garden centers in Canada? That would be great. Can you just stop sending people to Home Depot? And I'm a sensitive soul. I read the mail and I take it to heart, and wow, that was, I don't want to hurt nurseries, but I don't think I have that kind of power for one thing, but I was appalled to think that it could have been taken in that spirit of whatever you do, don't go to your local neighborhood garden center. Be sure you go to the big box stores and get some trees. If I thought that mail was a one-off and that our little bonsai episode couldn't possibly prompt an even more nasty response. I was very wrong. Another guy writes in, so the context here, at one point in the conversation, the guest mentioned that squirrels were the bane of his existence. They would scramble over the fire escape and break the bonsai in half. And he's trying to nurture life, and the squirrels are killing the trees. So I'm trying to show that trademark tapestry empathy. We listen to our guests, and I say, oh, the little buggers. Guy writes in to complain, and he says, please tell Mary Hynes to stop swearing on radio. When she called those squirrels little buggers, she needs to know that refers to the sin of sodomy, and it is very offensive. I've always been pretty diligent with listener mail. If you write to me, I will do my best to write back to you, if I'm at all able to. And that was the week I stopped reading the mail. I said to my colleagues, I'm done. If somebody else wants to take over, read the mail, write to listeners, that would be great. I can't do my job when I take feedback to heart. And if I keep reading mail like this, I'll be weighing every single word that comes out of my mouth, and I'll be opting for silence. Like, I just won't say anything. And I did not go back to the mail for a really long time. I'm back now. Things are a little more settled, a little more kind. And I'm gonna tell you one thing. No more stories about the gentle art of bonsai trees. We're done. We're in the home stretch of this season now, and it has brought us some really rewarding conversations. I have this special fondness for guests who are tackling serious topics, again, what we call the big ticket items, but they come in with a real humanity and a really great sense of humor. And we had a really good example this season with the writer Patty Krawick. And Patty likes to joke that she is the least spiritual Indigenous person that you will ever meet. She said she doesn't really have time for it. And then she went on to describe what she called this mystical experience that happened to her. Patty grew up with her mom, who was from Ukraine, and she didn't reconnect with her dad's Anishinaabe roots until she was in her 20s. And when she did, she was visiting Sioux Lookout, Ontario. She goes down to the water. She put her hands into the water, into the lake. And not only did she remember the place, but it was somehow clear to her that the place remembered her. She had this electric, unshakable sense, a physical reaction that the water was letting her know that she wasn't the only one remembering. And hearing that story, it was so powerful and so beautiful. And coming from a self-professed, I'm the least spiritual Indigenous person you will ever meet. Patty Krawick also brought to the studio the kind of playful streak we love in a guest. And so we ended up talking about something she just touched on in her book, Becoming Kin. It's about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and how she feels a real kinship with the Incredible Hulk because she knows the power of anger. And then we talked about Loki, the trickster, because I can go all night on the Marvel Cinematic Universe. If you want to talk superheroes, I'm your girl. I should be embarrassed by how often the Marvel Cinematic Universe makes an appearance on the show, but I seem to have no shame in that department. I am obsessed with radio, and I think I have been for a really long time, speaking as a listener now. I just love the company. And there are certain voices I've loved for a very, very long time. I don't know these people. I don't think I'll ever met these people. They're absolutely a part of my life. Most of them are baseball announcers. John Miller in San Francisco, John Sterling and Susan Waldman in New York. And last September, John Miller was signing off for the year. The Giants hadn't made the playoffs in Major League Baseball. And he said, be sure to tune in next year. It's gonna be 2023. We'll be back on the radio on February the 25th from spring training in Arizona. And so September 2022, I'm writing that date in my little planner. And then at as the year turned over, at the end of the year, I transferred that date into my new planner for 2023. And the fall and winter were so long and cold and dark. And then a few weeks ago, it's February 25th, and I turned on the radio, turned on the MLB app, actually, and there it was, John Miller on the radio from spring training in Arizona. And things didn't feel so cold and dark anymore from that day on. There is something about radio, I think for a lot of us, and podcasts and streaming, something about the voice that feels made for human connection. And I think some of the sweetest moments of human connection have been on the radio. I'm thinking of Vin Scully, the long-time Los Angeles Dodgers play-by-play man. He did the job for half a century. I borrowed a line of his to use on Tapestry once. Vin was talking about players who are on the injured list. And he said, Andre Dawson is listed as day-to-day. Aren't we all? I love that. I could host Tapestry for the next 80 years and not come up with something that beautiful. We're all listed as day-to-day. I tend not to have a great memory. I suspect my head is too full of classic rock song lyrics from 1972. But every once in a while, a guest will say something that really lands and it stays with me and I never forget it. And I remember the lovely Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He's been on the show a few times. And during the first of our interviews, I made the mistake of prefacing a question by saying, Rabbi, you have had to live through perhaps the worst thing that can befall a human being, watching your child get desperately sick. And Rabbi Kushner was not having a word of it. He was very kind, but he shut that down. And he said, look, there's no such thing as the suffering Olympics. There are all kinds of things in the human experience that bring deep, deep pain, and it does nobody any good to start ranking them. Oh, you were through this horrible thing, I can't even imagine. His point was that we all, just by virtue of being human, have to live through some really, really painful stuff, and this whole suffering Olympics is not helpful. Most of our interviews are done remotely. This was true even before the pandemic, so I almost never get to meet the guest in person. I'm in a CBC studio, the guest is in a studio, often far away. Most of the time I really like it like that, because I'm very busy during an interview. I'm making notes, I'm looking at the time code of when a guest said a certain thing. I'm jumping ahead, thinking, okay, do I go to the next numbered question, or do I flip 5 pages ahead because that will really flow? And if the guest is in the studio with me, I don't do any of that because it feels like it would be rude. You know, I don't want to be scrawled writing in a notebook. If you and I are across the table, I feel like it would just be rude not to be looking into your eyes as you're speaking to me. But every once in a while, there is a guest, and I think we should really be having a beer together somewhere and having this conversation. Or wouldn't this conversation be great in my kitchen over a cup of tea? And I had that feeling with the poem Malcolm Guite. Malcolm Guite is a former chaplain at Cambridge University and a literary scholar. My wonderful colleague, Rosie Fernandez, is the senior producer of Tapestry, and Rosie was an English major, so lives for literature. She loves it when we can book a poet. But we all loved Malcolm Guite. There was a beautiful moment in that conversation. Malcolm was talking about something he had learned from the poet Hynes, who said, do you know, I think the beautiful and musical quality of a line of poetry is a bit like the hidden joists underneath the floorboard on which the floor itself is sprung. You can't see it, but it's there to help the floor resist. It's there to help bear the weight. And then Seamus Heaney said to Malcolm Guite, the greater the weight of grief a line of poetry is asked to bear, the more musically sprung it must be. And moments like that, just these moments of wisdom and generosity from a guest, They really do stay with you, and we just all feel so fortunate to be working on this show. I've been thinking about Father Greg, the philosopher. We love philosophers on Tapestry. We also love historians and psychologists and folklorists and people who work in sociology and mythology. So I always find it really distressing when people hold up an education in STEM as being the only thing that matters. There was a news story the other day. The British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced that all British students would be taking math for several more years than they currently do. And math is great, I love math. But I've been thinking about this in the larger context of how embattled the humanities can be at university campuses all over the world, and how amazing the humanities are. So I loved it when someone on Twitter recently tried to explain, okay, look, here's why we teach music. Why do we bother with music? And that thread began, music is science, mathematics, foreign language, history, physical education. It develops insight and demands research. Music is all these things, but most of all, music is art. That is why we teach music. Not because we expect you to major in music, not because we expect you to play or sing all your life, but so you will be human. So you will recognize beauty, so you will be closer to an infinite beyond this world. You will have something to cling to, you will have more love, more compassion, you will have more gentleness, good. In short, you will have more life. And that was the end of the Twitter thread. And I found that so striking. We teach music and the humanities, I would say, so you will be human, so you will have more life. And that brings us full circle back to Father Greg MacLeod. The author of the book, Father Greg, A Life, Dan Doucette, said it beautifully. Father Greg MacLeod was a priest by calling, a philosopher by profession, a businessman by necessity, and a bon vivant by DNA. That is a beautiful, rich span of a life. Father Greg knew how to have more life. And it's just been such an honor to be part of this Father Greg MacLeod Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much.
Well, if I could ask Sanate to come down. Sanate here? Sanate is on the CBU soccer team. She played in Montreal last summer.
Yay.
She's really fast. She's also part of our CBU chaplaincy team. And she will bring the mic to you if you raise your hand to ask a question.
She run?
She'll run. She's from Malawi as well. Lesotho. And Priyanka is from South Africa. And Paul, who will do the thank you in a few minutes, is from Kerala, India.
Yes, we welcome questions if anybody has any questions.
Hi, Mary.
Hi.
My name is Brian Joseph. I was honored to be the Greg MacLeod lecturer last year, and I'm just busting to ask you about your time in Breton. Is it your first visit here, and what have you had a chance to see? What's your impression of the island?
Oh my gosh. It's my first visit. It's not my last visit, God willing. It's been... But you know, I worry that I'm not going to do it justice, Brian, because I'd heard about the fabled Cape Breton hospitality, and I was not prepared for this welcome. There was a Julia Child worthy lunch at the home of Father Bill Burke. And for the past few weeks, both Father Bill and Father Doug McDonald have been sort of gently holding my hand through this, because it's a bit perverse for someone who does the job I do, but I'm an off-the-charts introvert. I say no to most things that come my way. I hate flying. It's like, and for some reason, Father Bill's first email, which said, "Would you be interested in doing this?" It was an instant yes. It was just an instant yes without another thought given. And then I had the next 7 months to fret about, well, I guess I'll have to fly, and I guess I'll have to meet people, and I guess I'll just like say things, and I'll just all the really neurotic things that I contain multitudes, I guess, I don't know. And the just it goes beyond that fabled stereotypical warm welcome. The things that I didn't even know I needed, and Father Bill and Father Doug were right there, and then meeting Dan Doucette and meeting the lovely Tom, and it's such a surprise seeing Michael Higgins here, which was lovely, meeting Sister Eileen, meeting Rebecca, and I thought, okay, I might. Tomorrow's 2 flights because I couldn't fly direct, and it was like, but now I have friends here. You know, there was just something so sustaining about the whole experience. And that's not even telling you about the encounter at Ed's bookstore, which was sublime. And I didn't mention anything about what I do for a living or why I was here. And I believe this was Ed, and we started talking about sports because I tend to do that. And I said, oh yeah, I'm from Toronto. And I said, Leafs, we don't have to talk about that if you don't want to. And he said, the Toronto Maple Leafs, it's like Zen Buddhism. I don't even know if you ever heard of Tapestry. It's like Zen Buddhism. You could study them for your whole life, and you still wouldn't understand. I'm in the presence of a master. So I bought an armload of science fiction books. There was another wonderful bookstore, and just it's been. I suspected it would be something special. I was not prepared for this. I'm leaving with friends, and it's just been amazing. So thank you for asking, Brian.
I have to add to your Ed story, because in your presentation you talked about radio and the connections, and there are certain voices you recognize. While she was at Ed's, he looked at her and he said, "Are you on radio?" And he recognized.
That was somebody else.
Oh, okay, but they recognized your voice.
Yes, somebody else who works there. Yeah. Which I just think that's such a talent to have that kind of ear where you can, when I listen to John Miller, I know what station I'm tuned into. I know that's who I'm going to get. Someone who can just hear a voice on the street and say, oh, CBC, right? I just think, wow, do you have like perfect pitch for human voices or something?
Well, speaking of CBC, Mary, you were on this afternoon, of course, on Main Street, and perhaps if people didn't hear it, one of the questions that you were asked was the idea about people talking about the idea that they're spiritual, but they're not religious. So I was wondering if you could tell us about what you think about that phrase and what you think people mean by that. And also, I'm wondering, you talked about you've returned to sports many times on the program. I'm wondering, is there any topic that you haven't tackled or any area that you'd like to incorporate into discussions on
That's
the program?
good. Is that Dawn? I'm
Yes.
trying to look. Fabulous Dawn Monroe from CBC. A wonderful, cherished CBC colleague. I was really really glad that Jennifer got to that question during the interview, because this is another Rabbi Harold Kushner story. The man has a way with words. And I had always been quite partial to this idea of being spiritual but not religious, because there's a lot about organized religion that I find hard to take. And that seemed to be a bit of a way out. That seemed to be a bit of an exit where you could still sort of vaguely believe you were surrounding yourself with readings or lectures or things that touched on questions of ultimate meaning, but you didn't have to be tied down. You know, the easy phrase is, well, no dogma. We don't need dogma. We don't need organized religion. We don't need rules. And this was I don't think this was the same interview. I think this was the second time Rabbi Harold Kushner was on the show. And I said, you know, this makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Is that something you can respect? And he's a very plain-spoken man. He said the answer is no. No, that's not. Because what if I said to you, oh, I love education, but God, don't talk to me about those schools. And he said, that's essentially what you're saying when you try to cut religion out of the picture and still claim some kind of spirituality for yourself. And think of how ludicrous that would sound to you if you said, yes, education in the abstract, we really need all kinds of education, but schools are the worst. And it made me think I had fallen into a kind of lazy thinking about this, and that it is perhaps worth harder thinking, and not being so dismissive so readily about, well, organized religion, look at all the scandal, look at all the headlines, I don't want to be any part of that. And maybe some of this is just, as you get a little older, and one hopes gaining some kind of maturity, maybe you're able to hold two opposing thoughts at the same time, or have a view that is a little bit more complex, and that it's just that's not a sophisticated way of approaching the question to say, yep, spiritual good, religion bad. That no longer works for me, and I have the good rabbi to sort of. But I don't think I would have landed at this place of clarity had he not been so. He wasn't terse and he wasn't abrupt, but you could tell he had it up to here with people saying, I'm spiritual but not religious. And first it's, okay, what does that even mean? You know, when you say you're spiritual, what are you thinking of? What does that language mean? And the fact that he was so clear about it, and that he just didn't want any part of that kind of sloppy, maybe sentimental thinking, you know, that there's a vague thing called spirituality and we should all want it because it's good and it's wholesome and maybe it's holy, I don't know, you know, but religion, no, we're backing away from religion. He didn't have patience, I think, is what it came down to for that kind of thinking. On the what we haven't tackled, this isn't so much something we haven't tackled, but it's something we are very reluctant to revisit. And a listener wrote recently and said, Jean Vanier, what are you going to do? And there was an hour, in my early days on Tapestry, there was an hour-long interview with Jean Vanier. And the phrase living saint was used. Well, I didn't invent it, but I quoted it because it was used so readily in connection with him. And a listener said it's Tapestry's job to, you know, get into this and wade into this and talk about it. And our feeling on the team, and we've done quite a bit of coverage of sexual abuse on the part of religious figures, because scholars who study this aspect of it give it its own category. You know, they say this is worth studying as a particular kind of abuse, that not that other kinds of abuse are not worthy of study or are not desperately serious, but there are specifics to this kind of dynamic that are worth studying. So we've done a fair bit of that, and the Jean Vanier story, I think where we've landed recently as a team is that the news programs are going to be covering it very extensively, and that may give us a little bit of breathing room to be, our phrase for this is joy division. I'm harking back to the old band name, that in an age when so much news is catastrophic, when we cover something, is there a way that we can bring a little bit of light or hope, and our shorthand for that is joy division. You know, where's the joy division in this story? And that's something that comes up a lot in story meetings because of the nature of this beat, and it's like, what does it mean to be human? And you can sink under the weight of something like that when you see that as if those are your marching orders, that's pretty, there's a lot. It just makes my head hurt thinking of that sometimes. So the idea that can be kind of a set of guardrails for the show, not in every episode, but over time, are listeners able to listen to Tapestry and find something of joy division there, find some little bit of light or some little bit of hope? And I've been reading a lot, just personally, about a phenomenon called news avoidance, where really good people and committed citizens are saying, I'm done. I don't want to read your newspaper. I don't want to listen to your newscast. I'm not going to watch the news at night, because the way news seems to be interpreted by many news organizations is, here is your daily buffet of every bit of misery that's happening around the globe. We've got you covered 24/7. And this has a name, news avoidance, and journalists and scholars are taking it really seriously because numbers are dropping. But what I don't really get sometimes is managers say, why are our numbers dropping? And I just think, oh my God, have you listened lately? Have you read a newspaper? Have you watched a TV? And maybe my sister, who was a City of Toronto firefighter, calls me the sensitive soul in the family. So maybe I'm just someone who cannot handle a 24/7 diet of this is every disaster and calamity the world has to offer. So there are things that we've covered and then we've taken a step away. There are things we're still grappling with, in terms of, yes, news is certainly covering the Jean Vanier story. Is there a particular approach Tapestry could take that would complement, what the news shows are doing, what the newscasts are doing, what The Current is doing, and we're not settled there yet, and some of it is Rosie and I both together, like, bang that joy division bell pretty consistently, because we get it, and we get how dark and how dire a lot of things can feel the minute you turn on that radio or that television set or pick up that newspaper. It can be really, which is not to say that you check out as a citizen. You don't turn off the news forever. But the way that it's available now in a 24/7 way, and online or on Twitter or on Reddit or whatever, it can feel pretty punishing because it just does not. It's relentless, right? It doesn't stop. So, thoughtful question, Dawn. Thank you. Is this Sarah with you?
Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. CBU student, yay. Anything else? Any other questions?
Hi, thank you so much for that amazing talk. My name is Nicole. I have a question, and it relates back to what you were saying about favorite voices on the radio. And of course, yours is one of mine.
Thank you.
And another favorite is a woman by the name of Krista Tippett.
Yes.
Yes, from the On Being podcast.
Yes, yes.
and I listen to her quite frequently as well. And I love one of the ways that she begins her conversations, so you probably know what's coming if you listen to Krista. And the question that she often poses to her guests is one that provides a little insight into someone's life, and that is, what was your childhood like in terms of your spiritual upbringing or your religious upbringing? And I wondered if you felt comfortable perhaps in sharing a bit about that, but in particular about how it relates to what you do in that you host some of the most profound speakers and thinkers in some of the biggest questions that we're asking.
Thank you for the question. This episode hasn't been broadcast yet, but it'll go to air on Easter Sunday, and it's with someone who is a spiritual director, and he's written a book on restlessness and sees it as a kind of gift. It's the kind of gift you don't want, but once it's been in your life for a while, that restlessness can be a kind of guide, it can be useful, that time in the wilderness is never time wasted. It's a beautiful conversation, and one of the things we touched on, and he prompted this, this was something in a book he's written about restlessness. When he's acting as a spiritual director, he will open his conversations with, what were you taught about God? What's your idea of how God might feel about you? How do you feel about God? How might God feel about you? What's your conception of a divine being? And he sees that as absolute square one for working with someone as a spiritual director, because he said everything flows from that. So if it's a punitive God, if I can't do anything right, if I'm, no matter how I try, because of who I am, or any number of factors, if my idea of God is as a being who doesn't approve, this spiritual director's view is that's really harmful, and that's going to shape a lot of work that he does with a person. If you're not starting from a place where love is thought to be the ground of all being, then maybe he can help you rethink some of your ideas surrounding this. And my own, at the Julia Child lunch today, courtesy of Father Bill, I mentioned that I am a Mary Margaret Ann Gabriel Hynes, so I might not need to say more about where I come from. Catholic parents. My dad was born in Ireland, came to Canada as a young man, County Clare, and Catholic upbringing, First Communion, confirmation, have had periods of more spiritual, less religious. Things became beautiful and chaotic when I fell in love with a man who was Jewish, and we got married, and he was my Randy, and we were together 30 years, and he died in 2012 very suddenly. And one of the things I might not have seen coming, or many things I would not have seen coming, the Jewish part of our family life has now become so precious to me and something that I really, really need to safeguard, and my daughter feels that very strongly as well. And I think had Randy lived, I think we might have just sort of bumbled along as, well, this house is a little bit Catholic, a little bit Jewish, and we made that work. And now, when my daughter and I say grace, the grace is in Hebrew, it's the Jewish grace. At Christmas, we celebrate Christmas in a big way. We light the menorah, we celebrate 8 nights of Hanukkah. We're at the point where we don't need the booklet, because we can do all the blessings in Hebrew, even on the first night when there's a verse 2. And it's, I remember when our daughter was a baby, I try to figure things out by reading, which is not always, there's only so far the rational mind can take you, I think. But I read a book on, well, how do you raise a kid when one parent is Roman Catholic and one parent is Jewish? And there was a lot, this was 1996, so a lot of thinking has evolved since then, but there were some very strong authorities saying you will mess that kid up for life if that child does not have a very strong identity. So pick one or the other. And we didn't do that. We thought that just didn't feel like the kind of home we wanted to have. We wanted both of us to have sort of an expression. And also, there are things of beauty in both of those traditions that were just, we didn't want to kick either one to the curb, and say, well, no, this child will have one identity and that will be a strong point of pride. And I think in speaking to people about this, I'm not sure that hard line approach is the way everybody sees it 26 years later. And she has announced that she is Jewish. And I've said, it doesn't work like that. Judaism is matrilineal. I didn't convert, you're not Jewish. And that sounds obnoxious. I wasn't trying to be obnoxious. It was very, it was couched in sweetie pie. I don't think it works like that because I didn't convert. And so I think rabbis would not consider you, they wouldn't consider you Jewish. Well, she's now at Yale, and she has a professor of race and ethnicity whose father was Jewish and mother was Christian, and he has told Ella, yeah, of course you're Jewish, I'm Jewish. And professor of race and ethnicity has said, yeah, no, your mother's wrong, you're Jewish. Okay, like I can't argue with that, If Matt says you're Jewish, I guess you're Jewish. So I also love that elements of the way she was raised resonate so strongly and so beautifully in her that she just didn't go down the road of saying, well, I'm nothing, because I ended up being this mélange of things. Or no, I'm an atheist or I'm an agnostic and I don't want any part of it. I love a big part of me is delighted that she's a very independent thinker and that she's charting, she's been given, I think, a strong base and she's working her way through it and finding her own way. So it's all pretty rich, right? Anyway, thank you for the question.
Any question?
Hi, my name is Joe Porter. Really enjoyed your talk tonight.
Oh, thank you for coming.
I'd like to get to a really important question. What type of bass do you play and why did you become a bass player?
So I started out on a Fender P bass, made in Mexico, not entirely expensive, not top of the line Fender, with flat 9 strings on it because I adore James Jameson and that Motown sound. But then one day I was at a little music shop in Toronto and just kind of wandered in and saw a made in Japan Fender Jaguar, cherry red with matching red headstock. But it was too expensive. It was $1,300, and I thought, I'm a pretty crappy bass player, and I don't play outside my house. I'm not in a band. I play every Friday with my teacher at a lesson, and then I play during the week just for me because I have so much performance in my job. I don't want any performance on my bass. Not that I'm good. Not that anybody is asking me to perform, by the way. But I don't want to go down that road. And then lo and behold, on Kijiji in Toronto, a guy was selling my dream bass, the made in Japan Fender Jaguar, cherry red, matching red headstock. So I put flats on that as well. And that's become my go-to bass. But my husband made a paper mache sculpt. He was the only sports writer in the world who did ceramics and paper mache to unwind, like just such an artistic soul. He made a paper mache replica of my bass when I only had the honey blonde P bass. And so I can't ever give that up because my little paper mache replica from Randy is the P bass. So I'm not good enough to have 2 basses, and I don't care. Are you a bass player? Oh, no kidding. Oh, wow.
My first bass was a Gibson
Oh.
Ripper Grabber, I think.
Oh.
But anyway, now I walked into the music store here in Sydney one day to buy a set of strings, and I picked up an Ibanez Sound Gear bass, and it has a lovely small body and it's beautiful neck. It's wonderful to play.
That's okay. So do I need an Ernie Ball Music Man bass?
Oh man,
Maybe, eh?
they're like shoes. You can never have too many. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. I'm so glad a bass player came tonight. Awesome. Awesome.
Thank you, Sonate Soto. And now I'd like to invite up Paul. He's from Kerala, and he lives at the Newman Society house that was donated by Greg. And he's going to give the formal thank you and a gift on behalf of CBU and Newman Society.
Hi everyone. So my name is Paul. I am a CBU student, and I also happen to be a member of the Newman Society. Now, going over the biography of Mrs. Hynes, something that I noticed is that it is long. That is of course, it's a positive thing. Not many of us can say that, right? I can't. So, make it short. Host of Tapestry, covered stories in news, sports, and religion. Reported from 23 nations and 3 Olympic Games. So most of us, and a lot of us, are born into a nation. We live, we die in that same nation that we are born in. Most of us don't explore much beyond that. A lot of us does not have the means to, and a lot of us does not have the heart to explore. So 23 nations to build a career that takes you to 23 nations. That is quite an achievement in itself. Now coming back to the tapestry part, as I understand, it is a platform that discusses topics like spirituality, God, religion, philosophy, and these are the thoughts that fill our mind when we learn to slow things down a little bit. Most of us, especially the younger ones, are always in a bit of a rush. So we usually miss or skip these topics, but these are important. I think we need to find probably the right balance. Right? One man who I believe did find that balance would be Father Greg MACLEOD. So just like Mrs. Mary Hynes, Father Greg MACLEOD does not need an introduction here. Probably the best way to define him is how Mrs. Hynes defined him: a scholar, a philosopher, a priest, not a businessman. Now, I can keep going, but since this is a vote of thanks, I think it's better to keep this short. I don't want to test anyone's patience here. So I'd like to thank Mrs. Mary Hynes for coming here today and spending such a valuable time with us. I'd like to thank the CBU chaplaincy, the Newman House, and Father Doug for arranging this program. And thank you all for coming tonight. Before we leave, I like to handle this token of appreciation.
Oh,
This is very nice.
is that a CBU shirt? Oh, that is gorgeous. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's been such an honor to be here.
Okay, and finally, the final person will be the chair of the Newman Society here in Sydney. Father Bill Burke has a presentation as well.
Co-chair, the other one is Sister Mary Ali. Mary, we have two authors here tonight, both of whom have written about Greg. One is Professor Emeritus Harry Johnstone, who's sitting up there. Boundary Explorations, the Entrepreneurial Experiments of Father Greg MacLeod. And the other one is Father Dan Doucette, who was a lifelong friend of Greg's. Father Greg, A Life by Daniel Doucette. They're both autographed and signed for you. So.
Thank you so much.
And another very big thank you. There are two entities here. There's the Newman Club of Students with Doug at the chaplaincy. There's also the Newman Society in the community, and there are 7 of us as board of directors of that. And we operate the Newman House, which was Father Greg's house on the Esplanade, and a clarification here donated to us by Father Dan Doucette, and I don't care if you want that public or not, thank you. But we operate the house on fundraising and donations, and people have been very charitable with that. And the Newman Club and ourselves share the cost of the expense of these lectures. They're held twice a year, once in the fall, once in the spring. So Doug, thank you for your generosity from your budget and the work and cooperation, thank you. And tonight, I want to extend a special thank you to the Sisters of St. Martha who paid our expenses for your journey here. So.
Thank you very much, Father Bill, and thank you all for coming tonight. There is tea and coffee, there's oat cakes with Scottish treat, and chocolate chip cookies. So please hang around, and thank you for being here. God bless you all.